Diana Vega had always believed in the power of a plan. Growing up in a middle-class neighborhood in Chicago to immigrant parents who worked tirelessly, her father as a construction foreman and her mother as a hospital administrator, she had learned early that success was built on equal parts ambition, discipline, and foresight. These lessons had carried her through Northwestern University on a partial scholarship, through the grueling years at law school where she graduated third in her class, and eventually to becoming the youngest partner at Goldstein, Martinez and Amp Associates, one of the city's most prestigious law firms specializing in corporate law. At 38, Diana had the kind of life that appeared in glossy magazines: the corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, the elegant condominium in Lincoln Park, the carefully curated wardrobe of designer suits, and the marriage that was the envy of her social circle. But unlike the airbrushed perfection of magazine spreads, Diana knew the sweat and sacrifice behind each achievement, particularly her marriage to Eduardo Mendez. They had met 12 years ago at a charity gala benefiting the city's underserved communities. Diana had attended representing her firm, which had donated a substantial sum. Eduardo, then a rising star in the commercial real estate market with a reputation for identifying overlooked properties and transforming them into gold mines, had been there seeking networking opportunities, while everyone else had been captivated by the glittering ballroom and the promise of connections with the city's elite. Diana and Eduardo had found themselves drawn to the balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline. "Escaping the small talk?" Eduardo had asked, his Spanish accent subtle but unmistakable, as he offered her a glass of champagne. Diana had accepted with a smile. More like taking a strategic pause. Those conversations in there required the same energy as depositions, but with better catering. He had laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed incongruous with his polished appearance. "I couldn't agree more. I'm Eduardo Mendez." "Diana Vega," she'd replied, extending her hand. His eyebrows had risen slightly. "Vega? Española?" "Mexican-American," she'd clarified. "My parents came from Oaxaca." "Ah," he'd nodded appreciatively. "I'm from Madrid myself, came here for business school and never left." That initial conversation had stretched from minutes into hours, flowing from professional backgrounds to childhood memories, from favorite books to dreams not yet realized. By the time they had rejoined the gala, Diana had known she wanted to see him again. It wasn't just his obvious physical appeal, the tall, athletic build, the olive skin, the expressive dark eyes framed by laugh lines that suggested he smiled often, but the way he listened, fully present, as if her words were precious gems to be collected and treasured. Their courtship had been intense but purposeful. Eduardo had sent flowers to her office the following day, but not roses. Instead, she had received a stunning arrangement of calla lilies and blue hydrangeas with a note that read, "For the woman who stands out in any room." "Dinner this Friday?" It had been a small detail, but significant. He had been paying attention when she had mentioned offhandedly that she found roses predictable. Diana had always appreciated Eduardo's attentiveness to detail, a quality they shared. On their third date, when he had taken her to a small, family-owned Spanish restaurant tucked away in a neighborhood far from the tourist areas, she had watched him converse with the owner in rapid Spanish, inquiring about their olive oil supplier and complimenting the authenticity of the paella. "You remind me of my father," she had told him later that evening as they strolled along the lakeshore, the city lights reflecting on the water. "He always says you can tell everything about a person by how they treat people who can't do anything for them." Eduardo had squeezed her hand. "My mother taught me that. She was a teacher in a small village before we moved to Madrid. She used to say that true character is revealed in the spaces between public performances." They had married after 18 months of dating, a timeline that had surprised their friends who knew Diana's cautious nature and methodical approach to major decisions. But with Eduardo, certainty had replaced caution. Their wedding, held in the botanical gardens with a blend of Mexican and Spanish traditions, had been intimate but elegant. Diana still remembered the way Eduardo's voice had cracked slightly as he had recited his vows in Spanish, then English, his eyes never leaving hers. "You are the home I didn't know I was searching for," he had said. "With you, I am both anchored and free. The early years of their marriage had been marked by the heady excitement of building a life together while simultaneously advancing their individual careers. They had purchased their first property jointly, a historic brownstone that needed substantial renovation, and had spent weekends stripping wallpaper, refinishing hardwood floors, and discovering the particular rhythm of their partnership outside the bedroom. Eduardo had proven to be both visionary and practical, seeing the potential in spaces that others dismissed and having the technical knowledge to transform them. Diana had contributed her organizational skills and attention to legal details, ensuring that permits were filed correctly and contractors held to their agreements. Together, they had turned the brownstone into a showpiece that had sold for double their investment, giving them the capital to purchase their Lincoln Park condominium and establish a pattern that would define their financial relationship. Strategic investments managed together, with Eduardo taking the lead on real estate ventures while Diana focused on her legal career. "We make a formidable team, mi amor," Eduardo had often said, and Diana had believed him. They had complementary strengths and shared values, or so she had thought. The first 5 years had passed in a blur of achievement and connection. Eduardo had founded his own investment firm, Mendez Properties, specializing in commercial real estate development. Diana had made partner at her firm 2 years ahead of schedule. They had traveled extensively, hiking the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu, exploring the markets of Marrakesh, sailing along the Amalfi Coast. Each adventure had deepened their bond, creating a reservoir of shared experiences that Diana had believed would sustain them through any challenge. They had discussed having children, approaching the topic with the same thoughtful deliberation they applied to other major decisions. Both had agreed to wait until their careers were established, setting a timeline that would have them starting a family around the 7-year mark of their marriage. But when that milestone had arrived, Eduardo had suggested postponing. "The market is volatile right now," he had explained over dinner at their favorite restaurant, the one where he had proposed. "I'm close to securing the Thompson Building deal, which could double our portfolio. Let's give it another year, when we'll have more financial security and flexibility." Diana had agreed, though a small voice inside her had whispered that there would always be another deal, another reason to wait. Still, she had understood the demands of ambition. Her own caseload had been intensifying as she took on more high-profile clients. So they had adjusted their timeline, pushing the family planning conversation into a future that seemed to stretch endlessly before them. By their 8th anniversary, Eduardo's firm had expanded to 15 employees, including Claudia Rivera, the young secretary he had hired on the recommendation of a business associate. Diana had met her at the company's holiday party, a slender woman in her late 20s with gleaming dark hair and a melodic laugh that carried across the room. Eduardo had introduced them briefly, his hand lingering perhaps a moment too long on Claudia's shoulder as he had praised her organizational skills and dedication. "She's transformed the office," he had said. "I don't know how I managed before her." Diana had thought nothing of it at the time, attributing the slight discomfort she had felt to the general fatigue of social obligations during the holiday season. Claudia had seemed competent and pleasant, if a bit eager to impress. Diana had filed her away as simply another component of Eduardo's professional life, separate from their shared personal sphere. That separation had begun to blur in subtle ways over the following months. Eduardo had started working later, his arrivals home shifting from 7 or 8 in the evening to 9, then 10, sometimes later. He had explained it as the natural consequence of the firm's expansion and the increasing complexity of his projects. Diana, herself no stranger to long hours, had accepted this reasoning without question. After all, she had often spent weekends at the office preparing for major cases, and Eduardo had never complained. In retrospect, Diana would recognize that this period had marked the beginning of a gradual distancing, a slow erosion of the intimacy they had once taken for granted. Conversations over dinner had become briefer, focused more on logistical planning than meaningful exchange. Physical intimacy had become less frequent, initiated more out of habit than passion. Weekend brunches stretching into lazy afternoons had been replaced by parallel activities, Eduardo reviewing property assessments while Diana prepared case notes, sharing the same space but occupying different worlds. They had still functioned as a unit in public, attending gallery openings and benefit dinners with the polished coordination of dance partners who had memorized the steps but no longer felt the music. Diana had told herself that this was the natural evolution of a mature relationship, that the intensity of their early years couldn't be sustained indefinitely alongside the demands of their professional lives. She had believed that what they had lost in passion, they had gained in stability and mutual respect. Then had come the Thompson Building project, the largest in Eduardo's career, a 30-story office tower in the heart of the financial district, requiring significant renovation to attract premium tenants. Diana had watched Eduardo pour himself into the project with an energy she hadn't seen in years. He had seemed rejuvenated, his eyes bright with purpose as he had described this vision for transforming the outdated building into a modern workplace that would set new standards for the industry. "This is what I've been working toward all these years," he had told her one evening, spreading architectural plans across their dining table. "If we secure the right anchor tenants, this could be the foundation for an entire portfolio of premium commercial properties." Diana had been genuinely happy for him, recognizing the culmination of his ambition and skill. She had offered legal assistance with the more complex aspects of the contracts, but Eduardo had assured her that his team had everything under control. "Claudia has been coordinating with our legal department," he had said. "She's surprisingly knowledgeable about contract law. Apparently she took some paralegal courses before joining us." Again, Diana had felt that momentary twinge of discomfort, quickly dismissed. She had been busy with her own landmark case, representing a tech company in a complex intellectual property dispute that could set precedent for the industry. The case had demanded her full attention, requiring late nights and early mornings spent reviewing documents and preparing arguments. In the narrowed focus of her professional tunnel vision, she had missed the warning signs that her marriage was unraveling. Eduardo's calls had started going to voicemail when she rang. He had begun taking his phone with him even for short trips to the kitchen or bathroom, something he had never done before. His explanations for last-minute cancellations of dinner plans had grown increasingly elaborate. The scent of his familiar cologne had sometimes been overlaid with different fragrance when he returned home, floral, feminine. Diana, who had built her legal career on the ability to notice inconsistencies and connect seemingly unrelated facts, had failed to apply these skills to her own marriage. Perhaps she hadn't wanted to see what was becoming increasingly obvious. Perhaps the foundation of trust they had built had been too solid for her to imagine its collapse. Or perhaps she had simply been too absorbed in her own professional challenges to recognize the shifting dynamics in her personal life. The night everything changed had begun like many others in recent months. Diana had been working late at the office, preparing for a crucial deposition scheduled for the following morning. Around 8, she had received a text from Eduardo, working late on Thompson financials. "Don't wait up." She had responded with a simple okay, and returned to her documents. But as the hours had passed, she had found her concentration wavering, distracted by memories of earlier times when they had made a point of connecting despite their busy schedules. The surprise lunches Eduardo had brought to her office, the quick coffee dates between meetings, the late-night conversations over takeout where they had shared the challenges and triumphs of their respective days. Acting on an impulse that had felt both spontaneous and long overdue, Diana had decided to surprise Eduardo at his office. She had ordered his favorite meal from the Spanish restaurant they both loved, Gambas al Ajillo and Paella Valenciana, and had taken a cab to the Thompson Building, where Mendez Properties occupied the entire 27th floor. In the elevator, Diana had smoothed her skirt and refreshed her lipstick, feeling a flutter of anticipation at breaking their routine in such a simple but meaningful way. She had imagined Eduardo's pleased surprise, the warmth that would return to his eyes at this gesture of connection. Perhaps they would clear a space on his desk for their impromptu dinner, share a bottle of wine, and remember what had drawn them together in the first place. The elevator had opened directly into the reception area of Mendez Properties, dimly lit at that late hour. Diana had nodded to the security guard, who recognized her, and had made her way past empty workstations toward Eduardo's corner office. Light had spilled from beneath his closed door, confirming that he was indeed working late as he had said. She had been about to knock when she had heard it, laughter. Eduardo's distinctive chuckle followed by a lighter, feminine laugh that she had immediately recognized as Claudia's. Diana had frozen, her hand suspended in midair. Through the narrow gap in the blinds, she had caught a glimpse of movement, Eduardo standing behind his desk, Claudia beside him, their heads bent close together over what appeared to be documents. There had been nothing explicitly inappropriate in that tableau, nothing that couldn't be explained by the demands of the project they were working on. Yet Diana had felt a certainty settle in her stomach like a stun. She had watched for a moment longer, just long enough to see Eduardo reach up to tuck a strand of hair behind Claudia's ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek in a gesture of such casual intimacy that Diana had felt physically ill. She had not knocked, she had not revealed her presence. Instead, she had placed the bag of food on a nearby desk and had walked back to the elevator, her movements mechanical, her mind curiously blank. It had only been in the privacy of the descending elevator that the reality had crashed over her. Eduardo was having an affair with Claudia. The signs had been there all along, and Diana, trained to see what others missed, had been willfully blind. The cab ride home had passed in a blur. Diana had entered their empty condominium, moving through the elegant rooms that now felt like a stage set, beautiful but hollow, designed to project an image rather than contain a life. She had poured herself a glass of wine and had settled on their balcony, gazing out at the city lights while trying to make sense of the revelation. Part of her had wanted to confront Eduardo immediately, to call him and demand explanations. Another part, the strategist that had won impossible cases, had counseled patience. She had needed time to process, to consider her options, to decide how to proceed with the full dignity of her accumulated wisdom rather than the raw impulse of her immediate pain. Diana had slept in the guest room that night, unable to face the bed she shared with Eduardo. When he had finally returned home after midnight, she had heard him moving around the condominium, noticing her absence, pausing outside the guest room door without knocking. In the morning, he had greeted her in the kitchen with casual normalcy. "You slept in the guest room?" he had asked, preparing his usual espresso. "I didn't want to disturb you when you came in late," she had replied, watching his face carefully. "How did the work on the Thompson financials go?" "Productive," he had said, not meeting her eyes. "We're making progress." "We?" she had echoed. "The team," he had clarified quickly. "Claudia stayed late to help organize the projections." Diana had nodded, allowing the silence to stretch between them until Eduardo had shifted uncomfortably. "I should get going," he had said, checking his watch. "I have an early meeting with potential tenants." "Of course," Diana had responded, her voice neutral. "Don't let me keep you." Eduardo had hesitated, perhaps sensing the unfamiliar current beneath their exchange. But he had simply leaned in to kiss her cheek, not her lips, Diana had noted, before grabbing his briefcase and heading for the door. "I'll probably be late again tonight," he had called over his shoulder. "Don't wait up." Diana had waited until the door closed behind him before allowing her composed expression to crumble. The strategist in her had already begun formulating a plan, but the woman who had believed in their partnership felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath her feet, sending her into a free fall without end. Over the following weeks, Diana had embarked on a careful investigation of her marriage, applying the same methodical approach she would use for a complex legal case. She had reviewed their finances, noting unusual expenses that Eduardo had categorized vaguely as business development. She had checked their shared calendar and identified patterns in his late nights that coincided with Claudia's known schedule. She had even, in a moment of determination that had made her stomach clench with shame, accessed his email through a shared tablet he had forgotten to log out of. The evidence had been conclusive. While there had been no explicit messages confirming a physical relationship, the tone of the exchanges between Eduardo and Claudia had revealed an intimacy that extended far beyond professional boundaries. They had discussed personal matters, shared private jokes, planned meetings that had never appeared on the official calendar Eduardo shared with Diana. In one email thread, they had discussed a weekend conference in Boston that Eduardo had told Diana was a solo trip. In another, Claudia had referenced a dinner at an exclusive restaurant where Diana knew the reservation wait list extended for months. Most telling had been the casual mention of Claudia's apartment renovation, with Eduardo offering specific suggestions about the kitchen design that had indicated he had seen the space firsthand. Diana had catalogued each discovery with the detached precision of a scientist recording experimental results, compartmentalizing her emotional response to focus on gathering information. By the time she had decided to confront Eduardo, she had already consulted discreetly with a divorce attorney, had documented their marital assets, and had secured copies of all relevant financial records. The confrontation itself had been anticlimactic in its restraint. Diana had chosen a Sunday morning when they were both home, no work obligations providing an escape route. "I know about you and Claudia," she had stated simply, standing in the doorway of Eduardo's home office where he had been reviewing reports. Eduardo had looked up, his expression shifting from surprised awareness to resignation in the span of seconds. He had not attempted to deny it. "How long have you known?" he had asked, his voice quiet. "Long enough," Diana had replied. "I saw you together at your office a few weeks ago. I've since found other evidence." Eduardo had closed his laptop slowly, as if buying time to compose his thoughts. "I didn't plan for this to happen, Diana." "Few people plan to betray their spouses," she had said, her tone measured despite the simmering anger beneath her words. "Yet choices were made, repeatedly, that led to this moment." He had sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so familiar it had sent a pang through Diana's chest. "It's not that simple." "Actually, it is," she had countered. "You made vows to me. You broke them. The situation is precisely that simple. Our marriage hasn't been the same for years," Eduardo had said, a defensive edge entering his voice. "We've been living parallel lives, Diana. When was the last time we really talked? Really connected? We're more business partners than husband and wife." Diana had felt a flash of fury at his attempt to distribute blame. "And rather than addressing that with me, you sought connection elsewhere. Don't rewrite our history to justify your actions, Eduardo." He had stood then, moving toward her with palms outstretched in a placating gesture that she had found suddenly intolerable. Diana had stepped back, maintaining the distance between them. "What do you want to do?" he had asked finally. "I want a divorce," she had stated, the words emerging with surprising steadiness given the turmoil within her. "I've already spoken with an attorney." Eduardo's eyebrows had risen slightly, perhaps at her preparedness or her decisiveness. "I see. I'll be staying at the Four Seasons for the next week while you make arrangements to move out," Diana had continued. "My attorney will contact yours to begin the process." "Diana," Eduardo had begun, his tone softening into the one he had used countless times to persuade clients and partners. "We should discuss this further before making decisions we might regret." She had cut him off with a raised hand. "The time for discussion was before you decided to betray our marriage. I'm not interested in negotiations about whether our relationship continues. That decision has been made, by you, through your actions." The finality in her voice had seemed to register with Eduardo. His shoulders had slumped slightly, the practiced charm falling away to reveal a glimpse of genuine regret. "I never meant to hurt you," he had said. Diana had allowed herself a small, sad smile. "Intentions seem rather irrelevant in the face of consistent actions to the contrary, don't you think?" She had left him standing in his office, had packed a suitcase with mechanical efficiency, and had checked into the Four Seasons without allowing herself to break down. Only in the anonymous luxury of the hotel room, with the door locked and the privacy assured, had Diana finally permitted herself to feel the full magnitude of her loss. The tears had come then, hot and relentless, accompanied by waves of anger so intense they had left her gasping. She had raged at Eduardo's betrayal, at Claudia's complicity, at her own blindness. She had methodically destroyed the decorative pillows on the king-sized bed, had screamed into them until her throat was raw, had thrown a water glass against the bathroom wall and watched it shatter with vicious satisfaction. The storm had passed eventually, leaving Diana exhausted but clearer than she had felt in months. As she had sat in the window seat overlooking the city she had navigated so confidently in her professional life, she had made two promises to herself: she would emerge from this divorce with her dignity and financial security intact, and she would find a way to rebuild her life on her own terms, without allowing Eduardo's betrayal to define her future. What she could not have anticipated that night was the particular form her resilience would take, or the unexpected opportunity that would transform her pain into a power of its own unique design. The divorce proceedings had begun with a swift efficiency that had surprised Eduardo, who had clearly expected a more emotional, less organized approach from Diana. Her attorney, Meredith Chen, was a shark in Louboutins who specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for thorough preparation and strategic aggression. The good news, Meredith had told Diana during their first official meeting after the separation, is that Illinois is an equitable distribution state, not a community property state. This gives us some flexibility in negotiating a settlement that recognizes your contributions to the marriage and Eduardo's career success. Diana had nodded, reviewing the financial disclosures Eduardo's attorney had provided. I'm seeing some discrepancies in these statements compared to the records I secured before confronting him. Meredith's perfectly arched eyebrows had risen. Show me. Together, they had identified several accounts that appeared to have been omitted from Eduardo's disclosure, as well as transfers to offshore entities that seemed designed to shield assets from the divorce proceedings. This level of financial maneuvering suggests he's been planning this for some time, Meredith had observed, making notes with quick, precise strokes. Which actually works in our favor. Judges take a very dim view of attempts to hide marital assets. Diana had felt a cold clarity settling over her. He's been transferring these funds for at least 6 months. That coincides with when I believe the affair with Claudia began in earnest. Meredith had given her an appraising look. You're handling this with remarkable composure, Diana. I save my breakdowns for private, Diana had replied with a wry smile. Professional habit. Well, your professional habits are serving you well. Many clients are so consumed by the emotional aspects that they can't focus on the strategic elements. You're different. Diana had appreciated the assessment, though she knew the composed exterior masked deeper turmoil. Every night alone in her hotel room, every reminder of the life she had believed in, every unexpected encounter with a shared memory had threatened to unravel her careful control. But she had continued to compartmentalize, channeling her anger and hurt into the meticulous documentation that would strengthen her position. The most difficult moment had come 3 weeks into the separation, when Diana had returned to the condominium to collect additional belongings during a time Eduardo had agreed to be absent. She had found evidence that Claudia had been there, a distinctive perfume lingering in the master bathroom, a woman's scarf draped over a chair that had not belonged to Diana. The violation of having her rival in the space that had once been her sanctuary had sent Diana into a tailspin of rage that had ended with her systematically packing every photograph of herself and Eduardo into boxes, which she had then left stacked in his home office with a note, "Your revisionist history. Keep or discard as you see fit." Eduardo had attempted reconciliation once, appearing at her office unannounced with an arrangement of calla lilies that had felt like a calculated reminder of their beginning. "Diana, can we talk?" he had asked, standing awkwardly in her doorway. "Really talk, without attorneys as intermediaries?" She had regarded him coolly, noting the shadows beneath his eyes and the slightly rumpled appearance that suggested he wasn't navigating their separation as smoothly as he might have hoped. "I don't see what that would accomplish at this point," she had replied, continuing to organize the documents on her desk without inviting him to sit. "I made a terrible mistake," Eduardo had said, his voice low. "I've been thinking about everything you said, about choices and consequences. You're right. I betrayed your trust, and I'm sorry." Diana had finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "Is Claudia still working for you?" His hesitation had been answer enough. "That's what I thought," Diana had said, returning her attention to her work. "Please see yourself out, Eduardo. Any further communication should go through our attorneys." He had lingered for a moment longer. "I didn't expect you to be so ruthless about this." Diana had permitted herself a small smile then, though there had been no warmth in it. "You should have. You've known me for 12 years. I've never been one to accept betrayal with gracious forgiveness." After he had left, Diana had disposed of the flowers immediately, calling her assistant to remove them. She had continued her workday without interruption, focusing on a complex merger agreement that required her full attention. Only that evening, alone in her newly rented apartment overlooking the river, smaller than the condominium but entirely hers, had she allowed herself to acknowledge the bittersweet ache of seeing Eduardo, of recognizing both the man she had loved and the stranger he had become. As the divorce had progressed, Diana had immersed herself in work, taking on additional cases that challenged her intellectually and left little time for reflection. Her colleagues had noticed her increased intensity but had attributed it to professional ambition rather than personal recovery. She had maintained a reputation for composure and precision, never letting the turmoil of her private life affect her performance. In those focused months of legal work and divorce negotiations, Diana had rediscovered aspects of herself that had been gradually subsumed in her marriage: her capacity for independence, her appetite for calculated risk, her unwavering resilience. These realizations had been painful but ultimately empowering, reshaping her understanding of her past and possibilities for her future. The divorce settlement, when finally reached after 4 months of negotiation, had been favorable by most standards. Diana had secured the condominium, which she intended to sell, substantial liquid assets, and a percentage of Eduardo's firm that would provide ongoing income without requiring direct interaction with him. Eduardo had kept his business interests intact, including his prized Thompson Building project, which had become the flagship of his expanding portfolio. On the day the divorce was finalized, Diana had felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, sadness, anger, and beneath it all, a quiet determination. She had celebrated with a small dinner gathering of her closest friends, women who had supported her through the separation without judgment or platitudes. To new beginnings, her friend Sophia Torres had toasted, raising a glass of champagne. And to the most elegantly executed divorce I've ever witnessed, Diana had smiled, clinking her glass against the others. It's not the ending I would have chosen, she had admitted. But perhaps it's the beginning I needed. She couldn't have known then how prophetic those words would prove to be, or that Sophia, who had recently been appointed director of a major investment fund, would soon present an opportunity that would transform Diana's personal defeat into an unexpected triumph. The path to that transformation had begun innocuously enough, with a phone call from Sophia 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized. "Diana," Sophia had said without preamble, her voice charged with the energy that characterized all her professional interactions. "I need your legal expertise on an acquisition my fund is considering. Are you available for lunch tomorrow?" Diana had agreed readily, grateful for the distraction and the chance to engage her professional skills in a context entirely separate from her personal upheaval. They had arranged to meet at a new restaurant in the financial district, convenient to both their offices. As Diana had prepared for the meeting the following morning, selecting a sharply tailored charcoal suit and the pearl earrings that had been a gift from her parents when she had made partner, she had felt a spark of her old enthusiasm for complex challenges. The divorce had drained her in ways she was only beginning to recognize, but this, the intellectual puzzle of a new legal problem, the strategy of negotiation, the clarity of professional purpose, this was familiar ground where she knew her value without question. She couldn't have anticipated that this routine business lunch would initiate a sequence of events that would allow her to reclaim not just her professional confidence but a sense of personal justice that would astonish even her. Diana had arrived at the restaurant precisely on time, as was her habit. Sophia, perpetually running 5 minutes behind schedule, had arrived shortly after, sweeping in with characteristic vitality despite the weight of responsibility she carried as director of a fund managing billions in assets. "You look better," Sophia had observed as they were seated at a corner table with a view of the bustling financial district below. "More like yourself." Diana had smiled wryly. "I'm getting there. Some days are better than others." "That's recovery for you," Sophia had replied with the frank honesty that had characterized their friendship since law school. "Linear progress is a myth invented by self-help books." They had ordered quickly, both women accustomed to business lunches where efficiency was valued, and had turned to the matter at hand. "So," Diana had prompted, "tell me about this acquisition that requires my particular expertise." Sophia had leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice despite the privacy of their table. "We're looking at a commercial property in the financial district. 30 stories, currently at about 60% occupancy but with significant potential for increased value after renovations." Diana had nodded, familiar with such investments from her years of marriage to Eduardo. Sounds promising. What's the complication? The current owner is facing liquidity issues and needs to sell quickly, which creates an opportunity for us to acquire below market value. However, there are some complex tenant agreements that need careful review, and the building requires substantial updates to attract premium tenants. As Sophia had continued outlining the details of the property and the fund's interest in acquiring it, Diana had felt an increasing sense of familiarity with the description. By the time Sophia had mentioned the specific location, Diana had known with absolute certainty which building they were discussing. "Sophia," she had interrupted gently, "you're talking about the Thompson building." Sophia had paused, surprised. "Yes, that's right." "How did you know?" "Because," Diana had replied with a strange calmness that belied the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat, "it's the building where Eduardo's firm is headquartered, the renovation project he's been focused on for the past year." Understanding had dawned in Sophia's eyes. "Diana, I had no idea. The owner's name is Thompson Holdings LLC. I never made the connection to Eduardo." "Eduardo doesn't own the building," Diana had clarified. "Mendez Properties occupies the 27th floor and has been consulting on the renovation planning. They're one of the major tenants." Sophia had set down her fork, studying Diana's face carefully. "Does this create a conflict for you?" "We can find another attorney if this is too close to home." Diana had considered the question seriously, parsing through the professional and personal implications. "Eduardo and I are legally divorced. I have no financial interest in Mendez Properties beyond the settlement percentage, which is essentially a passive investment. There's no legal conflict." "That wasn't exactly my question," Sophia had said gently. Diana had met her friend's gaze directly. "If you're asking whether I can provide objective legal counsel regarding this acquisition, the answer is yes. I'm a professional, Sophia. I don't let personal history cloud my judgment." But even as she had spoken the words with perfect conviction, Diana had felt something shifting within her, a realization forming that contained both danger and possibility. "Tell me more about the current tenants and the proposed renovation plans," she had requested, her mind already racing ahead to connections and consequences that Sophia couldn't possibly foresee. As lunch had progressed and Sophia had shared more details about the Thompson building opportunity, Diana had listened with increasing focus, asking precise questions about the existing tenant agreements, the timeline for renovation, and the fund's investment parameters. Her legal training had allowed her to process the information objectively, while a separate part of her mind had begun formulating a plan so audacious it had almost made her laugh aloud. "So," Sophia had concluded as they had finished their meal, "are you interested in handling the legal aspects of this acquisition for us?" Diana had smiled, a genuine expression that had felt foreign on her face after months of careful composure. "I'm interested in much more than that, Sophia. I think I might want to invest personally in this opportunity alongside your fund." Sophia's eyebrows had shot up. "Really? That's unexpected. I didn't know you were looking at real estate investments." "I wasn't," Diana had admitted. "But this particular property presents unique advantages that align with my current financial goals." Diana Vega ordered a car service rather than driving herself home that evening. The revelation at Eduardo's office had left her hands trembling, her mind racing, and she knew better than to get behind the wheel in such a state. As the sleek black sedan navigated through Chicago's evening traffic, she stared out the window, watching the city lights blur through orange tears. The bag of Spanish food, Eduardo's favorite gambas a la Gila that she'd so carefully selected, now sat abandoned on some random desk in his office building, a pathetic metaphor for her marriage. "Everything all right, ma'am?" the driver asked, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. Diana composed her features instantly, years of courtroom control coming to her rescue. "Yes, thank you. Just tired." The driver nodded, returning his attention to the road. Diana was grateful for his discretion. The last thing she needed was a well-intentioned conversation with a stranger. The quiet gave her space to think, to begin processing the enormity of what she'd witnessed. It wasn't just the physical betrayal, though that cut deep enough. It was the casual intimacy of Eduardo's gesture, tucking that strand of hair behind Claudia's ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Diana knew that gesture intimately. It was how Eduardo had touched her in the early years of their relationship, a small gesture of tenderness that had always made her feel cherished, seen. To witness him bestowing it on another woman felt like having a precious memory stolen and corrupted. By the time the car pulled up to their Lincoln Park condominium, Diana had managed to compose herself. She paid the driver, adding a generous tip, and stepped out into the cool evening air. Their building rose before her, its elegant architecture in doorman service representing the life they built together. Now, it felt like a facade, a stage set for a play that had unexpectedly changed scripts without informing one of its lead actors. "Good evening, Mrs. Mendez," the doorman greeted her with his usual warmth. "Good evening, Joseph," she replied, forcing a smile. The elevator ride to the penthouse floor was mercifully empty. Diana used those moments to straighten her shoulders, arrange her face into a neutral expression, and prepare for the possibility that Eduardo might have returned early. She needn't have worried. The apartment was dark and silent when she entered, exactly as she'd left it hours earlier. Diana moved through the space methodically, turning on lamps, setting down her briefcase, removing her coat. These ordinary actions anchored her, provided a framework of normalcy when everything else felt tilted on its axis. In the kitchen, she poured herself a generous glass of rioja, the Spanish red wine Eduardo had introduced her to on their third date, and carried it to the balcony that overlooked the city. The night air was crisp, carrying the first hint of autumn. Diana wrapped her free arm around herself, sipping the wine slowly as she gazed at the Chicago skyline. From this vantage point, she could see the financial district where the Thompson building stood, where even now Eduardo and Claudia might still be together, working late on financials. The thought made her stomach clench with a visceral revulsion. Her mind, trained by years of legal practice to analyze and categorize, began to sort through the evidence. The late nights had started approximately 6 months ago, coinciding with Claudia's promotion from general office staff to Eduardo's personal assistant. The calls that went to voicemail. The unexpected business trips. The decline in physical intimacy between them. The gradual emotional distancing that Diana had attributed to their busy professional lives. In retrospect, the signs seemed so obvious that Diana felt a wave of self-recrimination. How could she, a woman who prided herself on her perceptiveness, who made her living by noticing what others missed, have been so blind? The answer came to her with sobering clarity: she hadn't wanted to see. The possibility that Eduardo might betray her had been so antithetical to her understanding of the relationship that she'd subconsciously dismissed the evidence accumulating before her. Diana's phone buzzed with a text message. Eduardo's name appeared on the screen, still at the office. A major breakthrough with Thompson Projections. Don't wait up. The audacity of the lie stoked a fire in her chest. Diana's thumb hovered over the keyboard, tempted to respond with the truth: "I know where you are and who you're with." But the strategist in her prevailed. She responded with a simple okay, and set the phone down decisively. Confronting Eduardo now, while raw emotion coursed through her, would be a tactical error. Diana knew herself well enough to recognize that her current state would not allow for the controlled confrontation she wanted. Better to wait, to gather more information, to approach this catastrophe with the same meticulous preparation she applied to her most challenging cases. She finished her wine and went inside, moving through the bedroom she shared with Eduardo with newly critical eyes. The king-sized bed with its luxurious linens, the framed photographs from their travels, Eduardo and Diana in Marrakesh, on the Amalfi Coast, at Machu Picchu. The Hisender's closets where Eduardo's tailored suits hung in perfect order next to her collection of designer workwear. The master bathroom with dual sinks, where their toiletries mingled in presumed permanence. Diana opened Eduardo's medicine cabinet, noting the expensive cologne he favored, the precision trimmer for his beard, the dental floss he used religiously. These intimately familiar objects now seemed like artifacts from a stranger's life. Who was this man who shared her home, her bed, her life? Had she ever really known him? She couldn't bear to sleep in their bed that night. Instead, Diana retrieved her laptop and case files from her briefcase and settled in the guest bedroom, determined to focus on work until exhaustion claimed her. The upcoming deposition provided a welcome distraction, a professional challenge that required her complete attention and left no space for dwelling on personal betrayal. Hours later, when she heard the front door open and close, followed by Eduardo's familiar footsteps in the hallway, Diana remained perfectly still, holding her breath as he paused outside the guest room door. Would he knock? Would he come in? What would she say if he did? After what seemed like an eternity, Eduardo's footsteps continued down the hall to the master bedroom. Diana released the breath she'd been holding, relief and disappointment warring within her. Part of her head wanted the confrontation, wanted to throw his betrayal in his face and watch him try to explain away the inexplicable. But the wiser part knew this wasn't the time. Sleep eluded her that night. Diana lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind cycling through memories of their 12 years together, searching for warning signs she might have missed, for some indication that Eduardo was capable of such deception. Had there been other women before Claudia? How long would this affair have continued if she hadn't discovered it? Was he in love with Claudia, or was it merely physical attraction, the cliched middle-aged man flattered by a younger woman's attention? As dawn broke, casting pale light through the guest room blinds, Diana rose and prepared for the day with mechanical precision. She showered, applied her makeup with care, and selected a crimson suit that she knew projected power and confidence. Armor for the battlefield her life had suddenly become. Eduardo was in the kitchen when she emerged, preparing his usual espresso. He looked up, surprise registering on his face at the sight of her. "You slept in the guest room?" he asked, his tone casual despite the question's implications. Diana met his gaze steadily. "I didn't want to disturb you when you came in late," she replied, the half-truth bitter on her tongue. "How did the work on the Thompson financials go?" She watched him carefully, noting the momentary flicker in his eyes. Guilt? Concern? Before he responded. "Productive," Eduardo said, his attention on the espresso machine rather than her face. "We're making progress." "We?" Diana echoed, unable to resist the small probe. Eduardo glanced up quickly. "The team," he clarified. "Claudia stayed late to help organize the projections." Diana nodded, allowing silence to fill the space between them, a technique she often employed during depositions to encourage nervous witnesses to elaborate. Eduardo shifted his weight, discomfort evident in his posture. "I should get going," he said, checking his watch. "I have an early meeting with potential tenants." "Of course," Diana responded, her voice neutral. "Don't let me keep you." Eduardo hesitated, and for a moment Diana thought he might say something more, might confess or explain or apologize. Instead, he leaned in to kiss her cheek, not her lips, she noted with a stab of awareness, before grabbing his briefcase and heading for the door. "I'll probably be late again tonight," he called over his shoulder. "Don't wait up." The front door closed behind him with a soft click that felt oddly final. Diana stood motionless in the kitchen, the apartment suddenly vast and empty around her. The facade of normalcy she'd maintained in Eduardo's presence crumbled, leaving her shaking with a toxic mixture of rage, grief, and humiliation. She glanced at the espresso machine Eduardo had left on, at the half-empty cup abandoned on the counter. With deliberate calm, Diana picked up the cup and hurled it against the wall, watching with visceral satisfaction as it shattered, dark liquid splattering across the pristine white surface. The act of destruction, however small, released something within her. Diana took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and began to plan. Her first step was to contact Meredith Chen, a divorce attorney she knew through professional circles. Meredith had a reputation for being both meticulous and merciless, particularly in cases involving infidelity. Diana secured an appointment for later that week, using a lunch break to ensure Eduardo wouldn't notice her absence from the office. Next, she began the meticulous process of documenting their financial situation. While she and Eduardo had maintained transparency about their major assets and investments, Diana realized with growing disquiet that she'd been less attentive to the details in recent years, trusting Eduardo to manage their joint finances while she focused on her career. That trust now seemed catastrophically naive. Diana spent her lunch hours at work accessing their online accounts, downloading statements, creating spreadsheets that tracked their assets. She requested copies of their tax returns for the past 5 years from their accountant, citing a need to review some investment decisions. She researched Illinois divorce law, familiarizing herself with the state's equitable distribution approach to marital assets. In the evenings, when Eduardo was predictably working late, Diana conducted a careful inventory of their condominium, photographing valuable items, documenting the provenance of art pieces and antiques they'd collected. She created a secure email account, separate from both her personal and work addresses, to store this information and communicate with Meredith. Throughout this process, Diana maintained a facade of normalcy during her limited interactions with Eduardo. They exchanged pleasantries in the mornings, discussed household logistics via text, and occasionally shared brief meals where conversation remained superficial. If Eduardo noticed any change in her demeanor, he gave no indication. His own behavior continued unaltered: late nights at the office, vague explanations, the gradual but unmistakable emotional withdrawal that Diana now recognized as the symptom of his divided attention. As she gathered information, Diana found evidence that troubled her beyond the emotional betrayal. Several large transfers had been made from their joint investment account to a newly established LLC that she didn't recognize. Eduardo had mentioned creating new investment vehicles for the Thompson Building project, but the timing of these transfers, beginning approximately when she estimated his affair with Claudia had started, raised serious concerns. Was Eduardo preparing financially for the possibility that their marriage might end? The thought introduced a new dimension to his betrayal. Not just emotional and physical infidelity, but calculated financial preparation that suggested premeditation rather than a momentary lapse in judgment. By the time Diana met with Meredith Chen at an upscale restaurant far from both their offices, she had compiled a comprehensive dossier on their marriage, assets, and Eduardo's increasingly suspicious financial maneuvers. Meredith, a striking woman in her late 40s with an impeccable bob and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, reviewed Diana's materials with professional appreciation. "Most clients come to me with nothing but tears and righteous indignation," she commented, paging through the neatly organized folder Diana had provided. "This is refreshingly thorough." "I wanted to be prepared," Diana replied simply. Meredith set down the folder and studied Diana with shrewd eyes. "Tell me what you want out of this divorce. Revenge? Maximum financial compensation? A quick, clean break? Your objective shapes our strategy." Diana considered the question carefully. "I want what's rightfully mine, half of the assets we built together during our marriage. I want transparency about any funds Eduardo may have hidden or transferred. And I want to emerge from this with my dignity and financial security intact." "Not revenge?" Meredith asked, a slight smile playing at her lips. "Revenge is an indulgence I can't afford right now," Diana replied coolly. "I need to focus on practical outcomes." Meredith nodded approvingly. "That's the right approach. Clients who prioritize hurting their spouse over securing their own future often end up achieving neither goal." They spent the remainder of the lunch discussing strategy, timeline, and immediate steps. Meredith advised Diana to secure copies of additional financial documents before officially filing for divorce, to establish separate credit in her name alone, and to prepare emotionally for Eduardo's reaction when he received the divorce petition. "Men like your husband, successful, controlled, image-conscious, often respond to divorce proceedings with disproportionate anger," Meredith explained. "The public acknowledgement of failure threatens their carefully constructed persona." Diana nodded, remembering Eduardo's rare but intense displays of temper when business deals went awry. "I'll be prepared." Before they parted, Meredith fixed Diana with a serious look. "One last piece of advice, from experience rather than legal training: don't engage with him emotionally once proceedings begin. Every conversation should have a practical purpose, and anything substantive should go through counsel. The moment you file, your marriage is effectively over. Treat it as such." Diana appreciated the clarity of this guidance. "I understand." "Good," Meredith said, closing her portfolio. "And Diana? Take care of yourself during this process. Divorce is a marathon, not a sprint. Even the most amicable separations require emotional stamina." Diana managed a small smile. I've run 2 marathons. I understand pacing. Then you're ahead of most of my clients already, Meredith replied, signaling for the check. The following week passed in a blur of preparation. Diana secured the remaining financial documents Meredith had requested, established credit cards in her name alone, and began researching temporary housing options for when the situation inevitably exploded. She maintained her professional commitments while operating on emotional autopilot, compartmentalizing her personal crisis so effectively that colleagues noticed nothing amiss. The opportunity to confront Eduardo presented itself unexpectedly on a Sunday morning. He had no scheduled meetings, no convenient excuse to escape the condominium. Diana found him in his home office, reviewing reports with his usual focused intensity. She stood in the doorway for a moment, observing the man who had been her partner for 12 years, the stranger he had become. I know about you and Claudia, she stated simply. Eduardo looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness to resignation in rapid succession. He made no attempt to deny it, which Diana found both a relief and an additional wound. Even now, at the moment of exposure, she had harbored a tiny, irrational hope that there might be some explanation, some misunderstanding. How long have you known? He asked, his voice quiet. Long enough, Diana replied. I saw you together at your office a few weeks ago. I've since found other evidence. Eduardo closed his laptop slowly. I didn't plan for this to happen, Diana. The cliché of his response sparked a flare of anger that Diana carefully contained. Few people plan to betray their spouses, she said, her tone measured. Yet choices were made, repeatedly, that led to this moment. Eduardo sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not that simple. Actually, it is, Diana countered. You made vows to me. You broke them. The situation is precisely that simple. Our marriage hasn't been the same for years, Eduardo said, a defensive edge entering his voice. We've been living parallel lives, Diana. When was the last time we really talked? Really connected? We're more business partners than husband and wife. The attempt to shift blame ignited Diana's carefully banked fury. And rather than addressing that with me, you sought connection elsewhere. Don't rewrite our history to justify your actions, Eduardo. He stood then, moving toward her with an expression she recognized from countless business negotiations, conciliatory, persuasive, designed to manage the situation. Diana stepped back, maintaining the physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm between them. What do you want to do? He asked finally. I want a divorce, Diana stated, the words emerging with a steadiness that surprised her. I've already spoken with an attorney. Eduardo's eyebrows rose slightly. I see. I'll be staying at the Four Seasons for the next week while you make arrangements to move out, Diana continued, the plan sheet formulated emerging with precision. My attorney will contact yours to begin the process. Diana, Eduardo began, his tone softening into the persuasive cadence she'd heard him use countless times in business settings. We should discuss this further before making decisions we might regret. The familiar technique, once charming, now manipulative in her eyes, only strengthened Diana's resolve. The time for discussion was before you decided to betray our marriage. I'm not interested in negotiations about whether our relationship continues. That decision has been made, by you, through your actions. The finality in her voice seemed to register with Eduardo. His shoulders slumped slightly, the practiced charm falling away to reveal a glimpse of what appeared to be genuine regret. I never meant to hurt you, he said. Diana allowed herself a small, sad smile. Intentions seem rather irrelevant in the face of consistent actions to the contrary, don't you think? She left him standing in his office, returned to their bedroom, and packed with efficient movements. The suitcase she filled contained carefully selected items, enough for a week at the hotel, versatile pieces that would serve for both office and evening, the jewelry her parents had given her that held sentimental rather than monetary value. She left behind the gifts Eduardo had given her over the years, the designer pieces they'd purchased together during their travels. Those material things suddenly seemed tainted, carrying memories she couldn't bear to wear or display. The Four Seasons welcomed her with the impersonal luxury that suited her current needs perfectly. Diana checked in, arranged her minimal belongings in the spacious suite, and then, only then, with the door locked and privacy assured, allowed herself to feel the full magnitude of what had happened. The breakdown, when it came, was both cathartic and terrifying in its intensity. Diana sobbed until her throat was raw, until her eyes burned, until her breath came in hiccuping gasps that bordered on hyperventilation. She raged in the soundproof privacy of the luxury suite, screaming into pillows, throwing objects against walls, unleashing the fury and grief she'd contained during the weeks of investigation and the confrontation with Eduardo. Hours later, emotionally spent but oddly clear, Diana ordered room service, took a long shower, and sat by the window overlooking the city that had been the backdrop to her marriage. Chicago spread before her, lights glittering against the darkness, indifferent to her personal tragedy. The vastness of the cityscape provided perspective. Her pain, however acute, was but one among millions of human stories unfolding beneath those lights. Diana's phone signaled an incoming text. "Eduardo, can we please talk? This isn't how we should end things." The following week unfolded with the surreal quality of a life suddenly bifurcated. Diana maintained her professional commitments with unwavering focus, executing a successful deposition in her major intellectual property case and participating in partnership meetings where strategic decisions were made for the firm's future. Colleagues who noticed her temporary relocation to the hotel accepted her vague explanation about renovations at the condo without question. In the evenings, she worked with Meredith to prepare for the formal divorce filing, refined her financial planning, and began researching apartments in neighborhoods she'd previously had no reason to consider. The process of reimagining her life without Eduardo was both daunting and, unexpectedly, exhilarating. Choices that had been made jointly for years, from living location to vacation destinations to investment strategies, were now hers alone to determine. Eduardo made multiple attempts to contact her, escalating from texts to calls to an unexpected delivery of calla lilies to her office, the flowers he'd given her when they first met, a calculated reminder of their beginning that Diana found more manipulative than touching. She maintained her boundary of communicating only through attorneys, a position that clearly frustrated Eduardo, whose business success had been built partly on his ability to charm and persuade in person. 10 days after their confrontation, Diana's attorney filed the divorce petition citing irreconcilable differences. Though Illinois law permitted filing on grounds of adultery, Meredith had advised against it. Unless there's a specific prenuptial clause tied to fidelity, proving adultery generally creates additional emotional stress without affecting the financial outcome, she had explained. Let's focus our energy on tracking those suspicious transfers instead. The investigation into Eduardo's financial maneuvers revealed a pattern of increasing concern. He had established multiple LLCs over the previous 6 months, transferring funds from joint accounts in ways designed to be technically legal but ethically questionable. None of these entities or transfers had been discussed with Diana, despite their long-standing agreement to consult each other on significant financial decisions. "He's been planning this," Diana said to Meredith during a strategy session in her office. "The timing aligns exactly with when the affair with Claudia intensified." Meredith nodded, reviewing the financial documentation Diana had compiled. "It appears so. The good news for us is that these transfers create a documented pattern of deception that will strengthen our position when arguing for a more favorable distribution of assets." "I never thought Eduardo would be so," Diana trailed off, searching for the right word. "Calculating?" Meredith supplied. "In my experience, spouses who cultivate external affairs often engage in parallel financial infidelity. The two behaviors stem from the same impulse toward secret-keeping and separate lives." Diana absorbed this insight, mentally reviewing the gradual changes in Eduardo's behavior over the past year, not just the emotional distancing and schedule changes, but smaller shifts that had seemed insignificant at the time, taking over bill payments that Diana had previously handled, suggesting they use separate accountants for their personal returns, discouraging her from attending certain business functions where she might interact with his colleagues. "I feel like I've been living with a stranger," she admitted. Meredith's expression softened slightly. "That's a common sentiment among my clients. But remember this, his deception reflects his character, not your judgment. You trusted your husband of 12 years, as any reasonable person would. Diana appreciated the perspective, though it did little to ease the persistent self-recrimination she felt for missing the signs of Eduardo's duplicity. The financial investigation took an unexpected turn when Diana's forensic accountant discovered references to a property in Michigan that did not appear in any of their joint holdings. Further research revealed that Eduardo had purchased a lakefront cottage in Harbor Country 6 months earlier, titling it solely in his name through one of his new LLCs. "Did you know about this property?" Meredith asked when they reviewed the finding. Diana shook her head, a cold certainty settling in her stomach. "No. We've talked about buying a weekend place in Michigan for years, but never moved forward with it because Eduardo always said the timing wasn't right financially." Meredith made a note. "We'll request all documentation related to this purchase. If he used marital funds to acquire it, the property is subject to division regardless of how he titled it." The discovery of the hidden lake house crystallized Diana's understanding of Eduardo's betrayal in a new way. This wasn't merely an affair, a moment of weakness or a midlife crisis. This was a calculated construction of a separate life, one that explicitly excluded her while using resources they had built together. Had he taken Claudia there? Diana wondered. Had they spent weekends in this secret refuge, laughing about how easily Eduardo managed his double life? The images that flooded her mind were so viscerally painful that she excused herself from Meredith's office, barely making it to the restroom before emptying the contents of her stomach. Later that evening, alone in her hotel suite, Diana made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would fight not just for her fair share of their marital assets, but for accountability. Eduardo's systematic deception merited more than a dispassionate division of property. It required a reckoning. The next morning, Diana contacted her bank and investment managers to discuss liquidating certain personal assets, stocks and funds she had inherited from her grandmother and kept separate from their marital finances. These resources, while significant, had been earmarked for a future Diana had once imagined sharing with Eduardo, perhaps early retirement, or extended sabbaticals to travel together in their 50s. The future no longer existed, and Diana was beginning to envision a different use for those funds, one that would require careful planning but might offer something beyond mere financial compensation, the restoration of power and agency that Eduardo's betrayal had stripped from her. The third week after the confrontation brought another unpleasant surprise. Diana received a text from a colleague at her firm. "Is Eduardo really engaged to his secretary?" That was fast. "Are you okay?" Diana stared at the message, her brain struggling to process the information. Engaged? Already? They weren't even divorced yet. The papers had only been filed 10 days earlier. She typed a response with fingers that felt curiously numb. "First I've heard of it. Thanks for the heads up." A quick search on social media confirmed the news. Claudia had posted a photo the previous evening, her hand displaying a substantial diamond ring, with Eduardo partially visible beside her. The caption reads simply, "I said yes. Blessed pound new beginnings." The calculated public announcement, before Diana and Eduardo's separation was widely known, before their divorce was finalized, felt like another betrayal, another attempt to seize narrative control and present Eduardo as moving forward rather than destroying what had come before. Diana took several deep breaths, fighting the impulse to respond publicly. Instead, she forwarded screenshots to Meredith with a brief message. "Please note the timing of this announcement. I believe it demonstrates pre-planning and bad faith in recent negotiations." Meredith responded within minutes. "Noted. His attorney will be hearing from me today. This changes our strategy." The engagement announcement, while personally devastating, provided unexpected leverage in the divorce proceedings. Eduardo's attorney, previously insistent on characterizing the separation as a mutual and recent decision, now faced documentation that contradicted this narrative. The timeline of the relationship with Claudia, the secret financial transfers, the hidden lake house, and now a public engagement mere days after divorce filing collectively painted a picture of premeditated deception that strengthened Diana's position. Negotiation sessions became increasingly tense. Eduardo, appearing without his customary composure, vacillated between attempting to expedite the process, presumably to begin his new life with Claudia, and fighting aggressively over specific assets. The Thompson Building project, which had once been his consuming professional focus, seem particularly important to him, not just his firm's offices on the 27th floor, but the consulting contracts that position Mendez Properties to benefit from the building's renovation and leasing. Diana observed these negotiations with growing strategic interest. Whatever Eduardo's financial maneuvering had entailed, the Thompson building clearly remained central to his professional identity and future plans. This attachment presented both information and opportunity as Diana refined the plan taking shape in her mind. 4 weeks after confronting Eduardo, Diana arranged lunch with her friend Sophie Torres, who had recently been appointed director of a major investment fund. They had kept in touch during the separation, with Sophia offering both emotional support and practical advice drawn from her own divorce 3 years earlier. They met at a new restaurant in the financial district, both women arriving directly from morning meetings. Sophia, perpetually 5 minutes behind schedule despite her professional precision, swept in with characteristic energy, embracing Diana warmly before they were seated. "You look better," Sophia observed as they settled into a corner table overlooking the city below. "More like yourself." Diana smiled wryly. "I'm getting there. Some days are better than others." "That's recovery for you," Sophia replied with frank honesty. "Linear progress is a myth invented by self-help books." They ordered efficiently, both accustomed to business lunches where time was valuable, and caught up on professional developments. Sophia's new position came with significant responsibility and influence over investment decisions, a role she had pursued for years and now embraced with characteristic thoroughness. "But enough about work," Sophia said, setting down her fork. "How are you really doing with everything? I saw the engagement announcement. That man has absolutely no shame." Diana appreciated her friend's indignation. "It was a shock," she admitted. "But in some ways, it clarified things. There's no ambiguity now about where we stand or what's happening." Sophia nodded. "Silver linings." "Still, the timing feels deliberately cruel." "It was," Diana agreed. "But it's also made the divorce negotiations more straightforward. Eduardo's attorney can't claim this was a recent development or a mutual growing apart when he's publicly engaged 3 weeks after separation." "Good," Sophia said firmly. "Use every advantage." That's what he's doing. They discussed the progress of the divorce, the discovery of the Michigan property, and Diana's plans to purchase a new apartment once the settlement was finalized. Throughout the conversation, Diana found herself considering how much to share about the idea that had been crystallizing in her mind, a plan that would require resources, discretion, and perhaps assistance from someone with Sophia's particular expertise. Before she could decide, Sophia shifted topics. "I actually have a professional matter I wanted to discuss with you, if you're open to it. My fund is considering an acquisition that could benefit from your legal expertise." Diana welcomed the change of subject. "Of course. What kind of acquisition?" "Commercial real estate," Sophia explained, lowering her voice slightly despite their private table. "A 30-story office building in the financial district that's currently underperforming but has significant potential after renovation. The owner is facing liquidity issues and needs to sell quickly, which creates an opportunity for us." As Sophia continued outlining the property and the fund's interest, Diana felt an increasing sense of familiarity with the description. By the time Sophia mentioned the specific location, Diana knew with absolute certainty which building they were discussing. "Sophia," she interrupted gently, "you're talking about the Thompson building." Sophia paused, surprise evident on her face. "Yes, that's right." "How did you know?" "Because," Diana replied with a strange calmness that belied the sudden acceleration of her heartbeat, "it's the building where Eduardo's firm is headquartered. The renovation project he's been focused on for the past year." Understanding dawned in Sophia's eyes. "Diana, I had no idea. The owner's name is Thompson Holdings LLC. I never made the connection to Eduardo." "Eduardo doesn't own the building," Diana clarified. "Mendez Properties occupies the 27th floor and has been consulting on the renovation planning. They're one of the major tenants." Sophia set down her fork, studying Diana's face carefully. "Does this create a conflict for you?" "We can find another attorney if this is too close to home." Diana considered the question seriously, parsing through both professional and personal implications. Eduardo and I are legally divorced. I have no financial interest in Mendez Properties beyond the settlement percentage, which is essentially a passive investment. There's no legal conflict. That wasn't exactly my question, Sophia said gently. Diana met her friend's gaze directly. If you're asking whether I can provide objective legal counsel regarding this acquisition, the answer is yes. I'm a professional, Sophia. I don't let personal history cloud my judgment. But even as she spoke the words with perfect conviction, Diana felt something shifting within her, a realization forming that contained both danger and possibility. Tell me more about the current tenants and the proposed renovation plans, she requested, her mind already racing ahead to connections and consequences that Sophia couldn't possibly foresee. As lunch progressed and Sophia shared more details about the Thompson building opportunity, Diana listened with increasing focus, asking precise questions about the existing tenant agreements, the timeline for renovation, and the fund's investment parameters. Her legal training allowed her to process the information objectively while a separate part of her mind began formulating a plan so audacious it almost made her laugh aloud. So, Sophia concluded as they finished their meal, are you interested in handling the legal aspects of this acquisition for us? Diana smiled, a genuine expression that felt foreign on her face after months of careful composure. I'm interested in much more than that, Sophia. I think I might want to invest personally in this opportunity alongside your fund. Sophia's eyebrows shot up. Really? That's unexpected. I didn't know you were looking at real estate investments. I wasn't, Diana admitted. But this particular property presents unique advantages that align with my current financial goals. What financial goals would those be? Sophia asked, her tone curious rather than suspicious. Diana considered how much to reveal. Sophia was both a close friend and a consummate professional. She would understand strategic thinking better than most. Let's just say I'm interested in diversifying my portfolio in ways that give me more direct control over my investments, Diana said carefully, measuring each word as she would in a high-stakes negotiation. The passive income from my settlement with Eduardo is one thing, but I find myself drawn to more active management opportunities. Sophia tilted her head slightly, her shrewd eyes studying Diana's face. They had known each other since law school, had supported each other through career challenges, relationship upheavals, and personal losses. The unspoken understanding between them ran deep. This wouldn't happen to be about anything other than prudent financial planning, would it? Sophia asked, a hint of amusement in her tone. Diana allowed herself a small smile. Every good investment serves multiple purposes, doesn't it? Financial return is certainly one objective, but the right acquisition can offer additional benefits, such as peace of mind, strategic positioning, the satisfaction of making independent decisions after years of compromise. Diana paused, then added with deliberate casualness, and perhaps the opportunity to establish new tenant relationships on terms that better reflect current market realities. Sophia's eyes widened slightly before her professional composure reasserted itself. I see. She took a sip of her water, considering. You know, while our fund would be the primary investor, we do occasionally bring in select individual partners for specific acquisitions. It adds a certain flexibility to our management approach. That's exactly the kind of arrangement I'd be interested in exploring, Diana replied. Particularly if it could be structured to give me specific oversight regarding the 27th floor. The two women regarded each other across the table, the unspoken implications hanging in the air between them. Finally, Sophia nodded decisively. Let me talk to my team about partnership structures. In the meantime, would you be willing to review the existing tenant agreements and renovation plans? Strictly as our legal counsel, of course. Of course, Diana agreed, feeling the first genuine excitement she'd experienced in months. Send me everything you have. I'll start immediately. They parted outside the restaurant with a warm embrace, Sophia whispering in Diana's ear, whatever you're planning, I want front row seats. Diana laughed, the sound surprising her with its authenticity. "I'll reserve them specially." As she walked back to her office through the bustling financial district, Diana felt a clarity of purpose that had been absent since the night she had discovered Eduardo's betrayal. The numbness that had alternated with rage, the fog of shock and disbelief, the paralysis of uncertainty, all were being replaced by the crystalline focus of a concrete plan. A plan that would require all her professional skills, financial resources, and strategic thinking. For the first time since her marriage had imploded, Diana felt something like her old self returning, not unchanged, certainly, but reclaiming the core of who she was beyond her role as Eduardo's wife. She was Diana Vega, methodical, resourceful, and underestimated at one's peril. Back at her desk, Diana created a new secure folder on her private server, labeled simply Thompson. Here she would compile all the information needed to determine whether her emerging plan was both financially viable and personally satisfying. The acquisition would need to make sound business sense regardless of the additional motivation. Diana had no intention of sacrificing her financial security for emotional satisfaction, however tempting that might be. Within an hour, Sophia had sent over the preliminary acquisition documents, property assessments, current lease agreements, renovation estimates, projected occupancy rates and rental incomes following modernization. Diana printed everything, closed her office door, and immersed herself in the details with the same intensity she'd brought to her most important cases. The Thompson Building, she discovered, was a 32-story Art Deco structure built in 1928, renovated once in the late 1970s, and now in need of significant updating to compete with newer offerings in the financial district. Its current owner, Thompson Holdings LLC, was a family trust facing liquidity issues due to other failed investments. Their need to sell quickly had created the opportunities Sophia's fund was exploring. The building's occupancy currently stood at 68%, below market average for its location, primarily because its outdated systems and amenities made it less attractive to premium tenants. The renovation plans were comprehensive: modernized HVAC and electrical systems, updated elevators, redesigned lobby and common areas, enhanced security systems, and the addition of amenities now standard in Class A office space, a fitness center, conference facilities, and a rooftop terrace. Most interesting to Diana were the current lease agreements. Mendez Properties occupied the entire 27th floor, one of the largest single-tenant spaces in the building. Their lease, negotiated 3 years earlier when Eduardo had expanded his firm, included favorable terms reflecting the building's then struggling occupancy. Most significantly, the lease was scheduled for renewal in 4 months, a fact that Eduardo had never mentioned during their marriage or divorce proceedings. Diana smiled as she highlighted this information. Eduardo's eagerness to finalize their divorce suddenly made more sense. He likely wanted the settlement completed before negotiating this significant business expense, preventing it from being considered in their asset division. Even more telling was an addendum to Mendez Properties' lease indicating Eduardo's firm had been contracted as a consultant on the building renovation, with compensation in the form of reduced rent and priority options for additional space following completion. This arrangement, initiated 8 months earlier, aligned precisely with the intensification of his relationship with Claudia and the beginning of his suspicious financial maneuvers. The picture emerging was one of Eduardo positioning his business for expansion while simultaneously preparing to exit his marriage. He had compartmentalized his life with striking efficiency, creating separate trajectories for his professional ambitions and personal relationships without allowing them to intersect, except, of course, where Claudia was concerned. Diana spent the remainder of the afternoon analyzing the financial projections for the Thompson Building post-renovation. Sophia's fund had calculated a potential 40% increase in rental income once updates were completed, with occupancy projected to reach 95% within 18 months. The acquisition price, while substantial, reflected the property's current underperformance rather than its potential value. By the time Diana closed the folder at 7:30 p.m., she had reached 2 conclusions. First, the Thompson Building represented a sound investment opportunity regardless of her personal connection to one of its tenants. And second, her participation would require significant personal capital, more than she could comfortably liquidate from her settlement and investments without compromising her long-term financial security. This realization led to another late night of financial planning. Diana reviewed her assets, calculating what she could reasonably contribute without excessive risk. Her divorce settlement had provided substantial liquid assets plus ongoing income from her percentage of Mendez Properties, ironically, the very business housed in the building she now contemplated acquiring. She owned no real estate following the sale of the condominium she had received in the settlement, having opted to rent temporarily while determining her next steps. The inheritance from her grandmother, conservatively invested over the years, represented her largest untapped resource. Diana had preserved this capital, viewing it as security against unforeseen circumstances rather than a source for current expenditure. Now, she wondered if this might be precisely the situation her pragmatic grandmother would have approved, an investment offering both financial return and the restoration of agency after betrayal. Diana's phone chimed with a text from Sophia, initial team response positive. Can discuss partnership structure tomorrow. Dinner at my place, 8 p.m.? Diana replied affirmatively, then returned to her calculations. By the time she went to bed, she had determined that she could contribute approximately 15% of the acquisition cost without undue risk to her financial position. This would be sufficient for meaningful participation but would not provide the level of control her evolving plan required. She would need to be creative about structuring the partnership, using her legal expertise and negotiating skills to maximize her influence despite her minority financial position. It was a challenge that engaged her professional instincts, providing welcome distraction from the ongoing emotional aftermath of her divorce. The following day passed in a blur of client meetings and case preparations, with Diana compartmentalizing her Thompson Building research and focusing on her regular workload. Only during her lunch hour did she permit herself to review real estate investment structures, refreshing her knowledge of mechanisms that might serve her purposes. By the time she arrived at Sophia's elegant Gold Coast apartment that evening, Diana had formulated a preliminary proposal that she believed would appeal to both Sophia's fund and her own objectives. Sophia greeted her with a glass of champagne. "I thought we should celebrate your new investment venture," she explained, ushering Diana into her minimalist living room where a charcuterie board awaited them. "Isn't that a bit premature?" Diana asked, accepting the glass. "We haven't even discussed terms yet." Sophia smiled knowingly. "My team reviewed the materials all day. We're definitely proceeding with the acquisition. The only question is how to structure your participation." She settled onto the sofa, tucking her legs beneath her in a posture more relaxed than her usual professional demeanor. "So, tell me what you have in mind. And don't bother with the sanitized version, I want the real story." Diana appreciated her friend's directness. After taking a fortifying sip of champagne, she explained both her financial capacity and her underlying motivation with uncharacteristic candor. "I can contribute approximately 15% of the acquisition cost," she concluded. "Not enough for controlling interest, but I'm hoping we can structure an arrangement that gives me specific authority regarding the 27th floor and its occupants." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "Normally, minority investors don't get selective management rights, but this is an unusual situation." She leaned forward, her expression turning serious. "Before we go further, this isn't about sabotaging Eduardo's business, is it? Because while I'm all for sophisticated revenge, I have fiduciary responsibilities to my investors." "Nothing so crude," Diana assured her. "I have no interest in destroying what Eduardo has built. That would only reduce the value of my settlement percentage." She smiled slightly. "I'm thinking of something more educational, a lesson in consequences, delivered through entirely legitimate business practices." Sophia studied her for a moment, then laughed. "I always said you were the most dangerous person in our study group. You never lost your temper during arguments. You just calmly dismantled opposing positions with surgical precision." "I'll take that as a compliment." It was meant as one. Sophia reached for her tablet on the coffee table. "Now, let's talk structure. My team has drafted several potential partnership arrangements. One in particular might interest you." She pulled up a document and passed it to Diana. "We're considering creating a special purpose entity, let's call it Tower Management LLC, to handle leasing and tenant relations post-acquisition." The fund would own the building itself, but this management entity would have exclusive authority over tenant agreements, renovations, and space allocation. Diana skimmed the document, immediately grasping the implications. And I could have a controlling interest in this management entity? Precisely, Sophia confirmed. Your 15% investment would be allocated partly to the acquisition itself and partly to establishing this management company with you as majority stakeholder. From the fund's perspective, having an experienced attorney overseeing tenant relationships adds value beyond your capital contribution. And this arrangement would be disclosed to the current owner? Diana asked, professional caution asserting itself. Of course. Everything would be completely transparent and legitimate. We're simply creating a specialized management structure that leverages your particular expertise. Sophia's eyes gleamed with barely suppressed amusement. The fact that this structure also allows you to become Eduardo's landlord is merely an incidental benefit. Diana couldn't help but smile at the elegant solution. It's perfect. When can we proceed? There's due diligence to complete, but we're moving quickly given the seller's motivation. I'd estimate 30 to 45 days to closing, assuming no unforeseen complications. And my involvement remains confidential until then? Sophia nodded. The fund will be the public face of the acquisition. Your role in the management structure would only become apparent after closing, when tenant communications begin. They spent the next 2 hours refining the details of their arrangement, with Sophia taking notes to share with her legal team for formal drafting. By the time Diana left shortly after 10, they had established the framework for a partnership that satisfied both Sophia's investment objectives and Diana's more personal motivations. This is going to be interesting, Sophia said as they embraced goodbye at her door. Just promise me one thing? What's that? Take pictures of Eduardo's face when he realizes what's happened. I want to see it. Diana laughed. I'll do my best. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as Diana balanced her regular caseload with increasing involvement in the Thompson Building acquisition. She reviewed due diligence reports, consulted on partnership agreements, and gradually liquidated selected investments to fund her participation. The process provided welcome focus during a period when her divorce was being finalized and Eduardo was making increasingly public appearances with Claudia. Their engagement featured in Chicago's business and social publications. Diana maintained her professional composure through it all, deflecting well-intentioned inquiries from colleagues with practiced responses about mutual decisions and different paths. Only in private conversations with Sophia and a few close friends did she acknowledge the depth of Eduardo's betrayal and her determination to emerge stronger from its aftermath.